Maybe I should be a little more respectful. You know, war is part of life. It's not the good part of life, but war is part of life nonetheless. And after not killing Saul for what, the third, the fourth, the fifth time now, David and his men, they returned to Ziklag. I'll show you Ziklag in a minute, where they find that the city of their home had been raided, their women and children taken, and the place had been burnt to the ground. This continued fighting with the Amalekites was a direct result of King Saul's failure and disobedience to God to kill all the Amalekites. I mean, the Amalekites will be a thorn in the side of Israel forever, as they are today, as they are modern day Iran, the Persians, and the #1 sponsor of terrorism in the world. So here's what happened in 1 Samuel 30:1 and 2. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but they carried them off and went on their way. That's got to be heart-wrenching to come back and find your whole town burned to the ground, all your women and children gone, right? And David and his men are heartbroken at the sign of their burned-out village. And the men blame David, of all people. Not only that, they threatened to stone him. I mean, it was just like an earlier generation grumbling against Moses when he led him into the desert, right? But he went from a hero to a zero just that quick. 1 Samuel 30:3-6. And when David and his men came to the city and found it burnt with fire, their wives and sons and daughters taken captive, then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives had also been taken, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Don't miss that. David strengthened himself. Beloved, in the midst of opposition, in the midst of your personal sufferings, at the loss of whatever you're going through, strengthen yourself in your Lord thy God, because that is where you'll find comfort. David found strength in the Lord, and this is proof again of his godly detour. Finding strength in the Lord regardless of your situation, regardless of what's going on around you. And David, the warrior, he could have immediately gone out and took revenge and attacked the Amalekites, took vengeance on them. But who does vengeance belong to?
The Lord.
The Lord. The bears. Nope, the Lord. But God was teaching David how to rely on God. And so to seek the counsel of God before taking any action on his own. And this shows the true faith and obedience to God that David expressed. David will inquire of the Lord before taking any human action. And David calls for the only priest left, right? Abiathar, the priest. 1 Samuel 37-10. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. Now, since Abiathar the priest is there, he can inquire of the Lord by means of the ephod, and David finds that he not only can go after them, the Amalekites, he will overtake them. And he encourages his men that God has spoken. When God speaks, it's a done deal. But only 400 men are able to keep up the pursuit, because they've already covered many miles. Remember, they had just come down from where Saul was, right? And the Philistines. And they had a 3-day journey back to their house. They find it burnt. When you're so emotionally overwhelmed, what happens? Your strength is sapped. You know, you just feel weak, and it's hard. But the Besor can be very wide and very deep, especially during certain times of the year. They've actually put a nice bridge across it now, so you can go across it in the wet season or the dry season. But it's dangerous, and 200 of his men could not go, this is before the bridge, okay? They couldn't go through the water and get to the other side, so they stayed there. And fortunately, they received valuable information from, of all things, an Egyptian. Now, what is an Egyptian doing between Israel and Gaza? And what does an Egyptian have to do with the Amalekites? Well, 1 Samuel 30, 11 through 13 will tell us. They found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. And they gave him bread, and he ate, and they gave him water to drink. And they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. 3 days and 3 nights. That's a theme in the Bible. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong? And where are you from?" And he said, "I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. And my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago." Well, isn't that a nice Amalekite for you? Slaves are cheap, right? You lose one, you just go get another one. It's not a big deal, but that's what they did, okay? This poor Egyptian service of this Amalekite leader that raided Ziklag and carried off David's family was just left in the wilderness to die. Life was cheap. And if it's a life of an enemy of yours, it's even cheaper. Life of a servant is even cheaper than that. But the man was so sick, he was basically left to die in the wilderness alone. And David's men saved him and revived him and gave him food and water. This is what happens on detours, right? We minister to others who are suffering. Again, you can see these patterns throughout the lives of all the guys in the Bible. So David ministers to this Egyptian, and he befriends him. Friendship evangelism, it's very important. Make a friend, touch a hand, share God, bring someone into the kingdom. But David wants to know, what happened to our families? Where are our women and children? And the Egyptian man who tells David that what the Amalekites did, he says this, which David already knew, but he says, "Hey, we made a raid against the Negeb of the Cherethites and against that which belonged to Judah and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." Well, David already knew this, right? This wasn't anything new. He had been to the burned out village. What David wants to know is, where is this raiding party right now? I want to go after these Amalekites. The Lord has given me favor. Show me. Can you take me down there? We're going to defeat them because God has ordained it. I bet that God also ordained this Egyptian man to get sick too. Yeah. God was helping David, left the man there, and didn't die. Think about that. He didn't die. 1 Samuel 30, verse 15, and David said to him, "Will you take me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God." Now, he's talking about Adonai. He's not talking about his gods, his polytheistic gods of Egypt. He's talking about the God of Abraham. "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band." So this Egyptian, he's had enough of the Amalekites. Better they think he just died in the wilderness and the birds and the animals ate him so that he would have his freedom. Again, if you think about it, the spies, right, who took in the Jews when they were going into the land, God saved them too. There are people that help the Jews along the way who God purposes them to be in the right place at the right time. All of us need to remember we're in the right place at the right time where God wants us. So look around and see what you're supposed to do. So in exchange for the information about the Amalekites, this man is going to win his freedom. And so the Egyptian spills the beans on the Amalekites, right? And David and their men can go rescue their families. 1 Samuel 16 and 17. "And when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day." There was a lot of them. "And not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. And the amount of the plunder that the Amalekites had stolen from the Philistines and Judah, it must have slowed them down because it was a lot. They had taken, and plus they had women and children. They took all the women and children. Remember, they didn't kill them. And women and children, they don't tend to move quickly. Okay, Herd is the exception. She's like the white tornado. But most women and children don't move quickly. Okay? So David finds the camp of the Amalekites, and they're celebrating their great victory with enthusiasm with the spoils that they are taken from David and the rest of them. And apparently they thought they were a safe enough distance away that they could party. Well, you don't get to party when you're stealing things, okay? Because David soundly defeats them and recovers all the captives and all the plunder. And it's a lot of plunder. So mourning turns to joy as the men are reunited with their families. I mean, it's a great triumph, and it actually is reminiscent of Abraham's recovery of the people and goods of Sodom and his daring pursuit of the 4 northern kings in Genesis 14. But God had protected those of Judah, and everything was recovered. Look at what David says in 1 Samuel 30, 18 and 20. David recovered all the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing. They got it all back. Whether great or small, sons or daughters, spoils, or anything that had been taken, David brought back all. And David also captured the flock and herds, and the people drove the stocks before him and said, "This is David's spoil." So 2 minutes ago they wanted to stone him. Now they're celebrating him. You see, people are fickle. People are fickle. You just got to understand that from the beginning. So they go from wanting to stone David to celebrating David. But this was a total victory for David until David and his men returned to Judah. And once they returned, fights broke out with respect to the spoils and how it should be divided up. I mean, come on. Those 200 men that stayed back, should they get something? Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and his children and depart." Well, that seems kind of bad, doesn't it? I mean, a victory should be everyone's victory. But, he goes on to say, "But David said, 'You shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us.'" You see, David realized something here. The dispute arises over, you ever want to see a real family knock off? I don't care how well you get along with your family. Let someone die and leave and not have a will, or leave something to somebody in a will that you wanted. Yeah, you all know. You all been there, right? I have never seen good Christians turn into pagans so fast as when someone dies and there's something they think is of value. And I'm just saying, it's amazing. But should these 200 men who didn't keep up and didn't fight with David and the others, should they get an equal share of the goods? Well, this is where, being a wise and fair leader, David insists that everyone share the same. Because the victory belonged to who? The Lord. You are so in trouble, Mark.
That's all right.
The victory was God's. David inquired before he went, and God said, I'll give you the victory, right? I mean, it was because it was the same God, the same circumstances when God handed Goliath over to David. David didn't kill Goliath. God killed Goliath. And when he handed the Amalekites into David's hands with his men, it was not man's victory, but God's victory. And David understood this. So you can see God working through David here. David was to be king over all Israel. All right, not just the ones who could go fight and kill for him. He needed to be fair and just in his dealings with his future subjects. And remember the wisdom that God gave to Solomon. Do you remember that? When there were 2 women fighting over the one baby, both saying the baby belonged to them. And Solomon said, okay, we'll cut the baby in half and give each woman half. Because he knew that the real mother would object. She would rather see her baby alive in the arms of an enemy than to be killed. See, this is what David is learning. And this is the wisdom that David shows here. God was the one who defeated the Amalekites, not his men. God won the victory through the men. Remember what you do for God. God's working through you. If you could do it, we wouldn't need God. So it's always God's battle. He works through us to his glory. So therefore, everyone should take part in the bounty. Additionally, the Amalekites have been stealing from the Israelites for generations, for years. And the Philistines had also been stealing from Israel. So when they got this bounty back that the Amalekites had taken from both Israel and the Philistines, it was a huge bounty. And it probably belonged to many more of David's people than just the people that had just experienced the theft. So David is not going to just give the 200 men a little portion. He's going to give everyone an equal portion. Because it all belonged to Judah and Israel anyway, right? So he says in 1 Samuel 30, 24 to 31, he says, who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be he who stays with the baggage. It's like saying, okay, some people go to war and some people stay home and protect the country. You know, you have to have people in both places. You can't send everybody to war, because what happened when they sent everyone to war? They lost their women and children. You got to have people at home protecting. He should have left those 200 back at where they were. So anyway, it says, and he made it a statute and a rule for Israel that from that day forward. So anytime Israel got a spoil, it was to be divided equally among the people. David made it a rule and a statute. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, to the elders of Judah, saying, here is a present for you from the spoils of the enemies of the Lord. And it was those in Bethel, Ramoth, and Negeb, and Jatir, and Aror, and Simbithamoth. There's a lot of strange names. In Eshtemoa, in Rachel, and in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, and the cities of the Kenites, in Hormel, and Boshashan, in Atak, in Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. So, because the plunder is so abundant, because there's so much, and again, why are the men complaining? There's a lot of it. They're all going to get a really good portion. Why are you complaining what someone else gets?
Greed.
And trust me, that's how it works, no matter where you are. So, David is presenting it to the elders of the towns of Judah, and those towns were mostly to the south of Hebron, where David and his men had been hiding from Saul anyway, and where David had received valuable assistance from these same towns as he was avoiding Saul. And Hebron is the most important of these cities, and that's why it's mentioned last. But a number of these places had probably been plundered by the Amalekites, and so the elders were very happy to get back what was theirs anyway. It was livestock and gold and silver and possessions that were stolen from them anyway. So while David is having great success with the Amalekites, right, because he's got God helping him, on the other side of town, dun dun dun, Saul is not doing well at all. I mean, Saul is fighting the Philistines without God. David fought with God against the Amalekites. Saul is fighting the Philistines without God. See, God had pulled his favor from Saul, right? After Saul was disobedient in his battle with the Amalekites. And the battle with the Philistines is not going well. 1 Samuel 31, 1 through 3. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Shua, the sons of Saul. And the battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Now this is all because Saul's disobedience. Saul was wounded in the battle. He was hit by an arrow. 3 of his sons, he had 4, but 3 of his sons, including Prince Jonathan, are killed. It's a tragic ending to a reign that at the beginning had so much potential, so much promise, only to be steadily found going towards destruction because of disobedience to God, who anointed Saul the first king of Israel. It's so sad. You see, at this point, Saul realizes it's over. I mean, it really is over. God's favor is gone. All but one of his sons has been killed in the battle. He is seriously wounded. You see, this is the point where your life flashes before your eyes. You see all your mistakes, but you're helpless to do anything about it. I bet you what Saul was thinking was, if I had just listened to God when I fought the Amalekites. Saul knows what he can expect if he's taken alive by the Philistines. He's going to be tortured, and he's going to be killed. And that's not something that Saul wants to experience. It's something none of us want to experience. Saul decides it's better to die in this battle than to be tortured at the hands of the Philistines. So Saul calls his armor bearer and says this. Saul says to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But the armor bearer would not do it, for he was greatly afraid. You see, when Saul realizes that his armor bearer is not going to do it, he has to fall on his own sword. He has to take his own life. So Saul fell upon his sword dead. So he fell upon his sword and died with him. The armor bearer also did the same thing. Thus Saul died, his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all his men on the same day together. I mean, think about the contrast that you have going on here between the success of David and his men fighting with God, saving the families of his men, and the failure of Saul losing everything. And it really is about obedience to God. I mean, Saul decided that he knew better than God. He didn't have to listen to God. See, that's what happened in the garden. It kind of messed us up there too, didn't it? When we think we know more than God. Saul thought that he was so big as king over Israel that he could just disregard God's command and do what he wanted. Beloved, you're never bigger than God. And you are never in the better knowledge than of God, okay? If you would, you wouldn't need God. You'd be your own God. And this is what happened. Saul messed up badly. So, 31:7. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled. And the Philistines came and lived in them. This happened during the Holocaust as well. When the Jews were taken to the concentration camps, Germans just moved right into their houses and lived there. It was really sad. And when they got out of the concentration camps, they went back to try to claim their houses and their land and their property. They were told, you don't own this. See, the Philistines were living in their houses, and this is when the men of Israel saw that King Saul and all his sons were dead. They fled their homes, and the enemies of Israel occupied, the Philistines. They took over and moved into their houses and took their possessions. And this is why Isaiah makes such a striking point in Isaiah 65, 21 through 23. When he says, they will build houses and live in them, and they will plant vineyards and eat their fruitage. They will not build for someone else to inhabit, nor will they plant for others to eat. For the days of my people will be like the days of a tree, and the work of their hands my chosen ones will enjoy to the full. He's talking about the millennial kingdom, but this is important. We experience what it's like when someone else moves into your house. But Isaiah prophesied there'll come a time when that won't happen. So once the Lord reigns from Jerusalem, we'll see that. Now the statement that war is hell is real. After a military defeat, the victors defame the bodies of their enemies. It's a warning to others, do not fight us. Because what you see we do to them, we will do to you as well. This will be your fate if you come against us. And the Philistines were exceptionally cruel to the Jews. And vice versa. I'm not going to lie, the Jews were cruel to the Philistines as well. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to their people. They put his armor in the temple of Ashtoreth, and they fashioned his body to the wall of Bethshan. Who is the god of the Philistines? Yeah, Ashtoreth. Okay, so in demonology, this is the great duke of hell in the first hierarchy with Beelzebub and Lucifer. It's a counterfeit trinity, guys. It's a counterfeit trinity. Okay? See, the cutting off of heads and the hanging of the bodies were to send that very strong message. My God is bigger than your God. Don't mess with us or we will kill you. This will be your fate too. And David, just as David had paraded the head of Goliath, right? He came in singing and dancing, holding the head of Goliath back into the town to show the victory. So the Philistines are going to take Saul's body and that kind of stuff, and they're going to parade it around, and they're going to hang it up with it's a trophy. It's a trophy for the victors. And this is what they did. And Saul's armor was placed in the temple of the Ashtoreths. So humiliating the prisoners and dying and stripping the dead were chief activities of the victorious armies. For the spoils of the battle were a big part of the wages for risking their life in battle. It's not like today. If you go and get injured in the war, that's never good. But we have penicillin. We have other medicines. We have surgery. We know things. Back in this day, if you got wounded, you pretty much died of infection. So it was a they were given the spoils because they were risking their lives. And they stripped off his armor, cut off his head after parading both parts from place to place. And we see this recorded in 1 Chronicles 10:9 as well. They displayed them in their temples. So the armor was put into the temple of the goddess Ashereth, and the head was in the temple of Dagon. Dagon is the Philistine god. So the Philistines publicly displayed and humiliated the corpses of Saul and his sons on the outside of the city wall of Bashan, a Philistine-controlled city in the Jezreel Valley. You see, for a Jew not to receive a proper burial was very, very sacrilegious and humiliating. And for the body to be mutilated and exposed, even more scandalous. And the Philistines were letting their people and their idols know that they had won a great victory over their chief enemy, the people of Israel. But Dagon had triumphed over Yahweh. Not really. Dagon did not triumph over Yahweh. God allowed the Philistines to be his punishment against Saul. Okay? Sometimes God uses other people to be his punishment against us for our disobedience. So, Saul's body is hanging on the public square and the Philistines are celebrating, but this did not sit well with the surviving Israelites. 1 Samuel 31:11 through 13. But when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard that the Philistines had done to Saul, that all the valiant men arose and went it all night and took the bodies of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethsan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted for 7 days. So when the men hear about this and how Saul's body and Jonathan's body are being dishonored, they cross into the Jordan by night, take down the bodies, and return them home. They remember Saul had rescued the city from the threat of the Amorites when he first became king. But because the bodies have been mutilated, they're going to be cremated rather than burned. This is the Jewish custom. If the body's mutilated, then it should be cremated. At least that was before World War II. And then the bones were buried to preserve a part of it, okay? So it must have been with a heavy heart that David awaited the information, the news of the battle that was going on with the Philistines, because although the Israelites would be defeated and Saul would be killed and David would rise to king, it would bring hardship and sorrow to the whole nation. I mean, when Saul died, it appeared as though Israel's experiment with a monarchy had been a complete and utter failure. The Philistines had increased their control in the area, and Israel was on the verge of splitting into the northern and southern kingdoms because of the dispute between David and Saul. And Saul's reign was a tragic one, and his death seemed inevitable. But how sad that his 3 sons should die with him in the battlefield. Jonathan had dreamed of being what? Co-regent, co-king with David. But that dream was never fulfilled. And how often the sins of one bring pain and death and suffering to others. Your behavior is not isolated, people. Your behavior affects the community, your families, the whole world. That dream was never to be fulfilled, though, because Jonathan was killed. It's a sin leading to death. The sins of both Saul and Eli cost them their lives and the lives of their sons. God is no respecter of persons. He doesn't care whether you're a Pharisee, a Sadducee, a king, or a slave. Disobedience. The wages of sin is death. So because of Saul's sins, he first lost his dynasty, then he lost his kingdom, and finally he lost his crown. And the warning of our Lord in Revelation 3:11 is applicable. Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast to what you have, that no one may take your crown. See, we are all earning crowns here on earth as we serve the Lord. So look to yourselves and do not lose the things that we worked for, but you might have your reward in full. Now, would it have made a difference? Would it have made a difference if against the battle of the Philistines, if David and his 600 men had fought with King Saul? Maybe. I mean, we're not really going to ever know. But know this, God is in control. And God had Saul chase David away from him so that David could grow and mature and learn to be a king and a leader, to get the skills he needed. And David was given success from God to defeat the Amalekites and return the great fortunes of the people of Israel, the bounty. You got to remember, though, God has a plan. You don't have a plan. God has a plan. God says if you have a plan, he laughs. But God has a plan. Israel may be defeated. Saul may have failed in his task of freeing the Israel from the Philistines. But God is still God. God still anointed Saul to complete his work through Saul, but Saul failed to obey and submit to God. So God anointed another. He anointed David to carry out his plan of salvation now through David. And David had much to learn before he could be a proper leader and to serve God. Here's what David needed to know. He needed to learn from Saul's mistakes and his own. David wasn't perfect. It is God's plan that must be followed, not ours. How different the world would be today if actually Saul had killed all the Amalekites. I mean, we'll never know because we're stuck with them. But Saul's death and Israel's defeat stand as a reminder to those of God's people today who live in situations where the congregation appears to have been defeated. Beloved, we look around and we see the physical persecution and secular indifference, abortion and all kinds of things, and it looks as if the congregation has been defeated. But we must remember that God is still God and God is still in control. God is still using obedient believers who are willing to submit themselves like David. Are you such a believer? Can God count on your support to further his kingdom? Each of us needs to look for where God is working and join him in his work. I mean, after all, God gave his life for our salvation. We should be serving him with all of our being so that we can hear what? Well done, good and faithful servant. Now, since we're studying cults in Bible study, I want to introduce you to the Philistine god Dagon. It seems that the ancient Dagon was a big part of the life of the ancient Philistines, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and other Canaanites. He's mentioned several times in the Hebrew Bible, and he was probably, Dagon may have been the first merman. And that's what he is, a merman. There's a lot of fish deities in the Canaanite gods. But Dagon survives as a supernatural character. If you do a search on him today, you'll find bands that are named after him and other crazy people with their crazy culture stuff today. But he's had a long run, and his legend dates back to 12th century BC. Now, the Philistines were a community of the Aegean people who settled in the southern coast of what we now call Israel in the 12th century BC. They were also called the Sea People since they came via the sea from Greece. And their pagan god, Dagon, was a fertility deity who morphed into an important Semitic god. Now, Dagon is represented by both grain and fish. These are some ancient depictions of him. These are symbols, fish and grain are symbols of fertility and multiplying, often depicted with the torso of a man and the tail of a fish. He may very well be the first merman, predating the merfolk, mermaids and mermen of the Greek mythology legend. Now, in the Hebrew Semitic dialogue, the root of Dagon simply means fish, God.
Wow.
When you talk about Noah being swallowed by a god gadol, a dog gadol is just a large fish. And so this is where he gets his name. God means fish. And some linguists interpret it to mean grain in the ancient language of the Canaanites. But the first known appearance of Dagon is in the records of Mari, Syria, and ancient Mesopotamia from 2500 BC and later. He's mentioned in the inscriptions of the Assyrians and the Babylonians as a protector and a warrior god, and in the text of the port city of Ugarit in ancient Syria. So a temple to his honor stood in this ancient place, right? The Philistines had a temple to Dagon, the fish god, and he rose to the third pantheon along with El and Baal. So this is the trinity there. And archaeologist expeditions also uncovered the temple of Baal of the city of Ugarit, so they went together. Now the Philistines, like I said, were originally in the Aegean from Greece, but they sailed across to Israel. They entered in the Promised Land about 11 BC, And the Philistine culture abilities, they were very sophisticated. They were doing ironworks before most cultures were. And so they had developed cities, they had great strategies, they were great warriors, they were also bigger than most Jews, and that's what happened. But they were on a trade route. Now this was where they lived, okay? So you have Ashan and Ekron, Gath, Askelon, Gaza. Those are the towns that they were they were famous for. Remember, the Israelites carried the ark through the desert, right? It had the 10 Commandments in it, it had Aaron's staff in it, it had manna from heaven, it allegedly had the horn that was taken from the ram that Abraham slew in the place of David. In the place of Isaac. But I want you to hear what happened, because there was a time when the Philistines captured the ark, right?
Yes.
Remember that? Okay,
Yes.
1 Samuel 5. When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. When the people of the Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen down, face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. So again, remember, Uzziah only merely attempted to touch the ark and he was killed.
Yeah.
There are times when God will allow certain things to happen. I think God is trying to send a message to the people of the Philistines. So they stood Dagon back up and put him in his place. But when they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord. Hello? Your God will bow to my God, okay? He had fallen face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. The hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. The rabbis say that they were afflicted with serious tumors, but they also said they were afflicted with hemorrhoids. So our God became a real pain in the tuchus to them. But these were afflicted with tumors, both Ashdod and his territories. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were going, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us, and to God our God. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? They answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. And so they brought the ark of the God of Israel there. But after they had brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against the city, causing a very great panic. And he afflicted the men of the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. But as soon as the ark of God came to Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out. They brought it around the ark of... So basically, God is just going everywhere and causing havoc and turmoil and pain and suffering, no matter what city they go to. Then they sent, therefore, and gathered together the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel. Let it return to its own place, that it may not kill our people. For there was a deadly panic throughout the whole city. The hand of God was very heavy there. And the men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to the heavens. See, this is what happens when you mess with our God. He might allow you to have victory over Israel. You might be the punishment sometimes against Israel, but the God still belongs to Israel.
That's right.
Dagon was no match for the God of Israel. No matter where the Philistines moved the ark, each of those cities were plagued, and they became a literal plague, not to mention there was also mice and vermin that accompanied it. Whenever they had the ark, they also had not just the tumors, but mice and vermin plague as well. And finally, after 7 months, the Philistines sent it back to the Israelites along with the gifts of the Israelites. So God allowed the Philistines the opportunity to repent and follow him, but they didn't, because they were stiff-necked and hardened. And the Philistines showed themselves to be unteachable. Even though they witnessed the power of the God of Israel over their fish god, they failed to repent and follow Yahweh. There you have it.
And
The
that's,
story of Dog.
that's awesome.
Dag Gadol. There you go.
That's the temple that Samson brought down.
I don't know why these are so blurry tonight. Everything's blurry. Maybe they're too big. All right. Well, I'm sorry.
Cool.
But I hope you guys understand that this is what happens when you fail to follow God and honor God. You will suffer. You might have tumors and hemorrhoids, mice and vermin. So anyway, that's just a little taste of some of the stuff you might get on Tuesday night when you come and learn about the different cults. So you know what day it is? It's Communion Day.